A story of betrayal, silence, and the long road back. The night Seoul betrayed Junho Beek. The city looked the same as it always did, brilliant and indifferent, 10,000 lit windows stacked against a black sky, neon bleeding color across the streets below in long, lazy ribbons. He stood at the edge of a rooftop parking garage on the 14th floor of the Lot World Tower, hands loose at his sides, watching the city breathe below him. He had driven Seoyeon here in the black car, the same way he drove her everywhere. He had handed her coat to her at the entrance the same way he handed her coffee in the mornings. Without ceremony, without expectation, simply because that was what you did when you cared about someone and they had become the center of your ordinary life. He did not know yet that she was already making a different calculation upstairs. He did not know that the folder sitting on Chairman Kang De-young's desk contained his name, his face, and the careful inventory of everything Junho had accidentally discovered 3 weeks ago in the back of a car he had been hired to repair. Junho was 31 years old, lean and careful in the way of men who had grown up learning that stillness was safer than noise. He had grown up in the Mapo district of Western Seoul, the son of a mechanic who believed that an engine told you everything you needed to know about the person who owned it, whether they were disciplined or careless, whether they paid attention to small things or only noticed when everything broke. Junho had inherited both the shop and the philosophy. He spoke quietly. He worked with precision. He trusted people fully or not at all, and Seoyeon Lim had, over the course of 2 years, become the only person he trusted completely. Seoyeon was 34. She was beautiful in the specific way of someone who had learned very early that beauty was a resource and had decided to manage it accordingly, not coldly, not cynically, but with the focused intentionality of a woman who understood which rooms she could enter and which doors would open if she simply stood near them long enough. She had come into Junho's world through a mutual friend, had stayed through genuine feeling, or what he had believed was genuine feeling, and had eventually become the thread connecting him to a version of life he had not known how to want before her. She was also, though Junho did not yet know this, the woman who had already decided that his survival was a problem she could not afford. The folder on Chairman Kang De-young's desk was the reason. Kang was what Seoul's legitimate business community called the head of a conglomerate, and what everyone else, quietly, carefully, never in public, called the boss of the Bukak Japak, the most deeply embedded organized crime network the capital had produced in a generation. He was 58 years old, and he had spent 30 of those years weaving himself so thoroughly into the architecture of Seoul's financial and political establishment that cutting him out had become, for most people who had considered it, a theoretical exercise rather than a practical one. He controlled real estate in Uido and Gangnam. He controlled the logistics networks that moved goods through Incheon Port. He controlled the particular silence that senior officials maintained when certain numbers moved through certain accounts. He was not violent in the way of men who needed to demonstrate power. He was violent in the way of systems, impersonal, structural, and completely indifferent to the individual people it processed. 3 weeks ago, Junho had been hired to repair a black sedan belonging to one of Kang's mid-level associates. The job was routine. The car had a concealed compartment behind the rear panel that the associate had not mentioned, and Junho had found it in the natural course of disassembling the interior. Inside were financial documents, printed ledgers, account numbers, transaction records connecting shell companies to properties to names that any investigative journalist would have considered the story of a decade. Junho had not understood everything he was reading, but he had understood enough. He had photographed the documents on instinct, replaced everything exactly as he had found it, and called Seoyeon that same evening because she was the person he called when something frightened him and he needed to think clearly. That call was the mistake that changed everything. Upstairs in Chairman Kang De-young's private office, Seoyeon stood near the window with her hands folded and her expression composed. Kang placed the folder on the desk between them without urgency. He was a man who had learned that calm was more frightening than anger, and he used it the way other men used raised voices. "The mechanic," he said. "He found something." Seoyeon did not ask how he knew. She had learned long ago that asking Kang how he knew things was the question of someone who did not yet understand what he was. "He doesn't understand what he found," she said carefully. "Understanding is not the requirement," Kang replied. "Possession is." He looked at her with the flat patience of a man who had made this kind of calculation many times and found it unremarkable. "Prove your loyalty, or I resolve both problems simultaneously." The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul blazed with its usual indifferent light. Seo-yeon thought about Junho on the rooftop parking level, waiting in the black car, probably listening to the radio the way he always did when he was waiting for her. She thought about his hands, the careful, precise hands of a man who fixed things for a living and had fixed something in her she had not known was broken. She thought about what it would mean to speak and what it would mean to stay silent. She stepped back, she composed her face, she made her choice. When she came downstairs 40 minutes later, the night air was still and cold. Junho smiled at her through the window of the black car. She smiled back, and 2 blocks away, the phone call that would end his freedom had already been made. Part 2. The arrest and the long education of a quiet man. The police came for him outside his own shop at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning. 4 officers, 2 unmarked cars. The efficiency of
Sir,
it
step
told
back.
Junho
Now,
immediately
we didn't
that
do
this was
anything.
not random.
What's going on?
It had been prepared,
Hands where I can see them.
organized,
Sir,
delivered
step
with the
back.
precision
Now,
of something
we didn't
that had
do
been
anything.
decided well in
What's
advance
going on?
by people who
Hands
were
where I
very
can see
sure
them.
of themselves. In the boot of his own delivery vehicle, a car he had not driven in 11 days, a car that had been in his locked garage the entire time, they found printed copies of the ledger documents, not the photographs on his phone. Printed copies in a sealed envelope with his fingerprints on the exterior. He did not understand how. He did not understand, yet that understanding how was the first thing you had to give up, when the machine that was supposed to deliver justice had been prearranged to deliver something else. He looked for Seo-yeon's face in the small crowd that gathered outside the shop. He found her on the opposite pavement. She was watching. When their eyes met, she looked away, not quickly, not guiltily, but with the deliberate and complete redirection of a woman who had already filed this chapter under a heading she was not returning to. That was the moment that would stay with Junho longer than the handcuffs, longer than the holding cell, longer than the 3 years that followed. Not the betrayal itself. The quality of her looking away, the absence of hesitation in it. Prison gave Junho 2 things that nothing before had given him in quite the same concentrated form: time and clarity. The first year he spent mostly in anger, not the loud, destructive anger of men who broke things or started fights, but the cold, interior anger of someone who kept replaying a sequence of events looking for the moment he could have chosen differently. He found it, eventually. It was the phone call. He should not have called her. He had called her because he trusted her, and he had trusted her because she had given him every reason to, and now he understood that the giving of reasons was itself a strategy. He filed that understanding in a part of himself he would not forget. The second year, he stopped looking for Seo-yeon to appear. He stopped expecting the visit that was never going to come, the explanation that did not exist, the version of events in which she had not made the choice she had clearly and completely made. He began instead to observe. Prison, he discovered, was a compressed version of every other human environment he had ever inhabited. The same hierarchies, the same currencies of trust and fear and usefulness, the same patterns of who rose and who fell and why. He watched without participating. He worked in the facility's maintenance workshop, because engines were what he knew, and because the concentration required to fix mechanical things was the closest thing to peace he could find in a place that had very little of it. The third year, he began to plan. Not revenge. Junho Beek was not, at his core, a man who wanted to destroy things. He wanted restoration. He wanted the kind of equilibrium that meant the people who had done what had been done to him could not simply continue doing it to the next person and the one after that. He wanted, in the precise and unfashionable word, justice. He understood that this was not a simple want. He understood that simple wants were easier to survive on. But it was the want he had, and he had learned by now to work with what was true rather than what was convenient. When a procedural error in the evidence chain was discovered by a junior defense attorney, who had taken his case pro bono out of genuine outrage at its construction. Junho's sentence was reduced, and he walked free 14 months before the original release date. He came out on a gray November morning with the clothes he had arrived in, a small amount of money, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs only to people who have been through something that most people only imagine. He did not look back at the facility when he walked away. There was nothing behind him worth looking at. Everything worth attending to was ahead. Part 3. The city the old man and the name Raftel became. Seoul had not changed. That was the first thing Junho noticed, and the thing that unsettled him most. 3 years had reshaped him entirely, and the city had simply continued. The same lights, the same noise, the same Cheonggyecheon stream reflecting neon in a way that had always seemed to him both beautiful and slightly dishonest. He felt like a man who had been rewritten in a language the city did not yet speak. He found a room above a dry-cleaning business in Dongdaemun, small and plain and sufficient. He found work 3 days later at a garage owned by a man named Hwang Sungjin, who was 67 years old, had been fixing cars in the same location since before Junho was born, and who had a policy of hearing people that other employers had decided were inconvenient. Sungjin asked no questions about the gap in Junho's employment record. He handed him a socket wrench, pointed at a disassembled transmission on the bench, and said, with the economy of a man who had long since stopped wasting words on things that did not require them, "Engines don't hold grudges." Junho worked. He was good at it, and it was enough. In the evenings he walked. He had always thought best while moving, and there was a great deal to think about. He learned gradually, through the particular information network of a city's street-level economy, customers at the garage, conversations overheard in ramen shops, the careful reading of local business news, that the world had not stood still while he was inside it. Chairman Kang De-young's empire had continued to expand. New developments in Uido. A logistics company acquisition in Busan. Political donations that made certain officials very comfortable and certain investigations very brief. The Don had not suffered in Junho's absence. He had prospered. Si-Ho-yeon had married Kang 8 months after the arrest. Junho received this information on a Thursday afternoon from a customer who mentioned it without knowing its significance, and he carried it with him for the rest of the day in silence, letting it settle into the structure of everything else he already knew. It did not surprise him. Surprise was no longer something he had much room for, but it recalibrated something. She had not just protected herself at his expense. She had leveraged his destruction as a step. That was a different category of thing. Not simple self-preservation, but something more deliberate and more cold. He filed it. He kept working. The name Park Tae-young reached him 2 months later through 3 separate and unconnected conversations in the same week, which was the kind of pattern Junho had learned to treat as information. Tae-young was 43, the kind of figure that emerged in Seoul once a generation, a man who had grown up on the edges of the Japak world, understood its language and its logic, but had built his own network on principles that were newer and harder to prosecute. He moved through the legitimate economy and the invisible one with equal fluency, building alliances through patience and precision rather than through the old Japak methods of direct intimidation and territorial violence. People described him with a particular careful respect, the kind that meant they were not afraid of him in the way they were afraid of Kang, but understood that crossing him would be a very permanent mistake. He was gaining influence in districts that had been Kang's exclusive territory for 20 years. Business owners who had paid tribute to the chairman were quietly, without announcement, redirecting that loyalty. Junho received a call from an unknown number on a Friday morning, while he was eating breakfast above the dry-cleaning shop. "We share an enemy," said a voice that was calm in the specific way of someone for whom calm was a decision, rather than a default. "I don't have enemies," Junho said. "I have an understanding of how things went." A brief pause. "Then perhaps we share an understanding. I would like to talk." They met in a public coffee shop in Gangnam. Park Tae-young arrived alone, which Junho noted, because men who needed to demonstrate power rarely arrived anywhere alone, and sat down across from him with the unhurried ease of someone who had nowhere else he urgently needed to be. He was compact, precise in his movements, with the kind of eyes that Junho associated with people who made very few decisions impulsively. Chairman Kang De-young destroyed your life, Taeyong said, without preamble or softening. Chairman Kang De-young's organization created the conditions, Junho replied. Someone who was close to me made the actual choice. Taeyong studied him. You distinguish between those two things. Yes. Most people in your situation would not. Most people in my situation spent their time in prison planning what they were going to do to the person who put them there, Junho said. I spent mine thinking about why it was possible for someone to put me there at all. Those are different projects. Taeyong was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I intend to remove Kang from the architecture of this city, not violently. Through the systematic withdrawal of what sustains him, loyalty, complicity, and the silence of people who know what he is and have calculated that speaking is more dangerous than staying quiet. He paused. You know his patterns. You were inside his orbit for 2 years. You know how he moves and who he trusts and where the foundations are weakest. You want me to help you take him apart, Junho said. I want to create balance, Taeyong said. I thought perhaps you wanted the same thing. Junho drank his coffee. He looked out at Gangnam in the morning light. He thought about Sungjin and the garage and the transmission he had been rebuilding all week. He thought about Seoyeon and the quality of her looking away. What happens to the people around him when it falls? He asked. The ones who were coerced are protected, Taeyong said. The ones who chose freely answer for their choices. No innocent people harmed, Junho said. It was not a question. That is my condition also, Taeyong replied. Junho set down his cup. I'll think about it, he said. He thought about it for 4 days. On the 5th day, he called Taeyong back. Part 4. The Woman Behind the Mansion Walls. Seoyeon Lim had believed, when she made her choice in Kang's office that cold November evening, that she was buying safety. She had understood the transaction clearly. One man's freedom in exchange for her own continued existence within a world that did not offer many alternatives to women who were not willing to disappear quietly. She had told herself it was pragmatic. She had told herself that Junho was resilient and young and would find a way through, because she needed to believe that to live with what she had done. She had been wrong about the safety. The Tanaka residence sat behind high walls in the Hanam district, a converted traditional estate that Kang had purchased and renovated with the particular aesthetic of a man who understood that the appearance of culture was a form of authority. There were gardens. There were staff. There were rooms that Seoyeon had never entered and was not expected to ask about. From the outside, it was the residence of a powerful and cultivated man and the woman who had chosen to stand beside him. From the inside, it was a cage with exceptional interior design. Kang was not cruel in the domestic sense. He did not raise his hand. He did not raise his voice except in the way that powerful men sometimes did when a point needed to be made clearly. A single controlled sentence delivered at a temperature that foreclosed argument. But he monitored everything. Her phone was reviewed. Her social connections were managed. When she wanted to visit friends, she was required to mention it in advance and was accompanied by a driver who was not a driver in any meaningful sense. When she traveled, it was because Kang had a reason for her to be somewhere. She had chosen this. She understood that. It did not make the walls shorter. She thought about Junho more than she had expected to. She thought about the particular quality of his attention, the way he listened to people as though what they were saying was the most important information currently available to him, which was a quality she had not encountered in many people and had not fully valued until it was gone. She told herself that this was nostalgia rather than feeling. She told herself the chapter was closed. The thought was never entirely convincing. What changed Seoyeon's situation from uncomfortable to dangerous was a single overheard conversation in the corridor outside Kang's study. 6 months before the night, she went to find Junho at the garage. Kang was speaking with his senior advisor, a man named Choi Byung-soo, who had been with him for 15 years and was, in the organization's internal hierarchy, the person whose loyalty Kang valued most and trusted least, because Chairman Kang De-young trusted no one with anything that resembled completeness. The Park Taeyong problem is growing, Byung-soo said. Problems that grow are problems that were not managed early enough, Kang replied. He has the Uedo corridor. 3 of the Mapo contracts have moved. A silence, then Kang's voice, quieter and therefore more frightening. When loyalty weakens, we identify the source of the weakness and remove it, starting with anything that is not essential. Seoyeon had stood in the corridor for a long moment after their voices moved away. She understood what she had heard. She had been listening to Kang's communications for 3 years. She knew what not essential sounded like in his vocabulary. She knew the speed with which things that were not essential became things that had been dealt with. She began, that same week, to copy financial documents onto a flash drive. Not out of courage, she would not have claimed courage for it. Out of the same cold, pragmatic calculus that had shaped every other significant decision of her adult life. If she was going to fall, she would not fall empty-handed. She copied 12 documents over 4 weeks. She kept the drive in the lining of a winter coat she rarely wore. She told no one. When Kang announced, without warning, that they were leaving the country within 48 hours, she understood that her window was closing. The garage was dark when she arrived, except for a single fluorescent strip above the main bay that Junho always left on at night, because he said a dark garage was a garage that looked abandoned, and abandoned things attracted the wrong attention. She had remembered that about him on the drive over, the dozens of small, careful habits of a man who paid attention to things most people overlooked, and the remembering had made the drive harder than she had anticipated. He was pulling down the security shutter when he saw her car. He stopped. He stood with his hands resting on the shutter and watched her step out with the particular stillness of someone who has been surprised and is deciding how much of the surprise to show. She showed him everything she had. He showed her nothing. "I need your help," she said. 3 years of silence stood between those words and anything that could follow them. She felt the weight of it physically, not guilt exactly, though guilt was present, but something denser. The weight of a choice that had kept growing long after the moment of choosing had passed. "You chose him," Junho said. His voice was the same, quiet, precise, the voice of someone who said what was true without needing to perform it. "I chose survival," she said. "I thought they were the same thing. They weren't. That distinction is not as useful to me as you might think." She handed him the flash drive. She explained what was on it and what she believed it would mean for Kang, and why she would not be alive to see it used if she did not leave within the next 36 hours. She did not ask for forgiveness. She understood that forgiveness was not the transaction available here. What was available was smaller and more practical, and she tried to present it clearly. "Why me?" Junho asked. "Because you know how he operates," she said. "Because you understand his patterns better than anyone who has never been inside his world. And because—" She stopped, started again. "Because once you were the most trustworthy person I knew, and I need to trust someone right now. That list is very short." Junho looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. She owed him that much, the not looking away. "Leave," he said finally. "I'll think about it." She left. He stood in the empty garage for a long time after her taillights disappeared, holding the flash drive and the accumulated weight of everything the past 3 years had been building toward. Then he went inside and opened it. What was on the drive was more than she had described. It was comprehensive, specific, and cross-referenced in the way of documents that had been kept by someone who understood they might one day be needed. Account numbers, property transfers, names, dates, the paper skeleton of an empire that had been built on the assumption that no one with this information would ever be both alive and willing to use it. Junho called Park Taeyong the next morning. They met in Taeyong's private office in a building that, from the outside, appeared to be an import and export consulting firm. The building was, in some technical sense, an import and export consulting firm. It was also a number of other things, in the way that many of Taeyong's legitimate enterprises were also other things. Junho had come to understand, in the weeks since their first meeting, that Park Taeyong's particular genius was the construction of surfaces that were true without being complete. He shared a portion of the drive's contents, enough to establish its significance, not enough to transfer full leverage before the terms were clear. Taeyong recognized immediately what he was looking at. "This is enough," Taeyong said quietly. "To start," Junho replied. "The strategy matters as much as the information. If this is released incorrectly, Kang suppresses it the way he has suppressed everything else, and the only result is that we have identified ourselves and removed ourselves from the equation. We need it to appear as internal betrayal. Leaks from within his own structure, delivered to journalists and investigators in a sequence that makes them corroborate each other before anyone realizes they're connected." Taeyong studied him. "You've thought about this carefully." "I had 3 years," Junho said simply. They spent 2 hours mapping the sequence. The first leak would go to a financial journalist at the Korea Economic Daily who had been investigating Tanaka's property holdings for 18 months and had been blocked twice by sources she could not identify. The second would go to a federal financial crimes investigator, Taeyong, trusted through a third party. The third would be structural. Documents released to 3 competing media organizations simultaneously, so that each one's instinct to scoop the story would prevent any single one from being suppressed or bought. "Seo-yeon needs to be protected before the first leak," Junho said. "Once the process starts, Kang will look for the source. She is the most visible candidate." "Agreed," Taeyong said. "We move her first, everything else follows." "One more condition," Junho said. "No violence. Not against Kang, not against his organization, not against anyone. This ends through exposure and the weight of consequence, not through methods that make us the same category of thing we're trying to remove." Taeyong was quiet for a moment. "You understand that insisting on that principle will make this harder and slower." "I understand," Junho said. "Those are my terms." Taeyong extended his hand. Junho shook it. The alliance was formed in the clean, old-fashioned way of 2 people who understood what they were agreeing to and had decided to mean it. The message reached her through a route she did not recognize. On a phone she had purchased herself from a convenience store 2 weeks earlier and kept hidden in the same coat lining as the original flash drive. 3 words, no context, no signature. "Be ready tonight." Seo-yeon had been ready for longer than tonight. She had been ready in the way that you are ready when you have been planning something for months, while performing the daily theater of a life you are preparing to abandon. Present in every room, available for every conversation, steady and unremarkable and completely elsewhere inside herself. She waited until the household's late rhythm settled, the security rotation, the staff departures, the particular quality of silence that meant Kang had retired to his study with the documents, and the whiskey that bookended his evenings. She packed nothing that would be noticed missing. She took only what was in her coat: the drive, the phone, the letter she had written to Junho 3 days ago, and then debated sending, and then decided to give him in person if the opportunity arose. She went through the garden. There was a section of the western wall where the camera coverage had a gap that she had mapped over 18 months of quiet observation. She had never mentioned it to Kang. She had stored it the way you store things you hope you will never need. The car was where the message had indicated. Junho was not driving it. It was one of Taeyong's people, a quiet woman in her 30s named Myrae who said nothing beyond the destination and kept her eyes on the road with the focused economy of someone for whom this particular task was simply the current task in a long sequence of tasks. Seo-yeon sat in the back and watched the Hanam walls recede in the rear window and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief, not fear, but a profound and slightly vertiginous sense of finally being in motion after years of standing completely still. Alarms sounded at the residence 20 minutes later, according to Taeyong's intelligence, which was transmitted to Junho at the safe house where he was waiting. He read the message without expression and then went to tell Seo-yeon that the first part was complete. She was sitting at a small table in the kitchen of the safe house, both hands around a cup of tea, looking at the steam rising from it with the expression of someone discovering that the thing they had been afraid to do had turned out to be survivable. She looked up when Junho came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Don't thank me yet, he replied. It's not over. I know, she said. I mean, thank you for coming to find me at all after everything. She paused. You didn't have to. No, Junho agreed. I didn't. He poured himself tea and sat down across from her. Outside, the night air settled quietly around the safe house, soul invisible beyond the shuttered windows. But I wasn't going to become the kind of person who leaves someone in danger because the danger is inconvenient. I spent 3 years deciding what kind of person I was going to be when I got out. That was part of the decision. Seo-yeon looked at him for a long moment. You decided who you were going to be, she said quietly. In prison, most people just try to survive. Surviving without a direction is just waiting, Junho said. I'd had enough of waiting. Choi Byung-soo broke first. He had always been the weakest structural element in Kang's organization. Not in terms of capability, which was considerable, but in terms of the fundamental calculation that sustained loyalty in organizations like Kang's. The belief that the consequences of staying were less costly than the consequences of leaving. When the first leaks appeared in the Korea Economic Daily and whispers began moving through the city's business architecture that federal investigators had opened a formal inquiry, Byung-soo's calculation shifted within 48 hours. He contacted Taeyong through an intermediary. He offered cooperation in exchange for a negotiated outcome. Taeyong called Junho before responding. O'Hara wants to switch, he said. What does he have that we don't already have? Junho asked. Testimony, real-time documentation of the overseas accounts, and the location of 2 properties Kang has been using as contingency escapes. Then speak to him, Junho said. But verify everything before he's offered anything, and make sure his cooperation is conditional on honest testimony, not a version he's edited for his own protection. Byung-soo's cooperation broke 3 things simultaneously. Kang's confidence in his inner circle, his ability to move assets offshore on the timeline he had been planning, and the particular silence of several officials who had been waiting to see which way the wind resolved before committing to a direction. The federal agents came on a Wednesday morning in December, 3 months after Seo-yeon had left through the garden, and 4 months after Junho had first met Taeyong in the Gangnam coffee shop. They came to Kang's main Uedo office, not to the residence, which was a detail that told Junho they had done their work carefully. Coming to the residence first would have given the household staff time to move things, but the office arrival was clean and contained, and left no room for the kind of managed retreat that Kang's organization had historically used to survive exposure. Chairman Kang De-young surrendered without incident. That detail, too, told Junho something significant. Men who surrendered without incident were men who had already done the calculation and understood that the calculation had resolved against them. He had not fought because fighting would have required believing he could win. He no longer believed that. Junho was not present at the arrest. He heard about it from Taeyong, who called him at the garage where he was working on a fuel injection system that had been giving him trouble all morning. He set down his tools, sat on the workbench, and let the information settle into him without trying to shape it into anything it wasn't. He did not feel triumph. He felt something quieter and more durable, the specific satisfaction of a process completed with integrity, which was a different thing from winning and, in his experience, considerably more lasting. He called Sung-jin into the bay and told him they should go get dinner somewhere decent. Sung-jin looked at him for a moment, then nodded once and went to get his coat. Taeyong's people arranged Seo-yeon's documents, a new name, a visa, a flight departing from Incheon International on a Thursday evening toward a city she had chosen herself from a list of places where Chairman Kang De-young had no architecture and no reach. She had chosen Paris. She had never been to France. She spoke no French. She had decided these were advantages rather than obstacles. Before she left, she asked to walk by the Chingyecheon stream. Junho went with her. It was an evening in December, cold and still. The canal lights reflecting sharply in the dark water, the city doing its loud and indifferent thing. The city doing its loud and indifferent thing around them, the way cities do around people who are having quiet and significant moments. They walked for a while without talking. Junho had learned, in the weeks at the safe house, that Seo-yeon did not fill silences unnecessarily, which was a quality he had always valued in people and had forgotten, or perhaps set aside, as a quality she possessed. "I thought choosing him would protect me," she said eventually. Not as confession, she had moved past the register of confession into something more considered, as an honest accounting. "I was wrong, but I want you to know that the part of me that chose him was not the same part that cared about you. I know that distinction doesn't help you, but it's true, and I wanted to say something true." Junho walked in silence for a moment. "The part that cared about me made a phone call," he said, "and then the part that chose him made a choice. Both of those things happened. The first part doesn't undo the second one." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." "But I don't need it to," Junho said. "I'm not carrying what happened between us as damage anymore. I carried it that way for a long time. I don't anymore. It's just something that happened. Part of the sequence that made me understand certain things. I'd rather have understood those things than not." Seo-yeon stopped walking. She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read and then said, "How did you do that?" "Do what?" "Decide not to be destroyed by it." Junho thought about it honestly. "I decided that being destroyed by it would mean that what Kang's organization did to me was permanent, and I wasn't willing to let it be permanent. That felt like the one thing I could control." He paused. "It took most of the 3 years to actually do it. It wasn't a quick decision." At the airfield, there were no formalities, just the quiet efficiency of Taeyong's organization moving a person from one configuration of her life to another. Seo-yeon had one bag. She had the coat with the empty lining. Before she boarded, she handed Junho an envelope. "I wrote this 3 weeks ago," she said. "Before I knew if you'd help me, before I knew if any of this would work." He took the envelope. She went through the gate without looking back, which was, he thought, the right way to go. He opened the letter in Sungjin's garage the next morning, sitting on the workbench with his coffee, while the old man swept the bay floor in the methodical, unhurried way he did everything. She had written that she hoped he had found, or would find, the version of himself that existed before she had made the choice she made. She wrote that she understood if that version was not recoverable, and that she did not write this asking him to recover it on her behalf. She wrote that the most honest thing she knew about him was that he was the only person she had ever known who had the capacity to be hurt by someone, and then choose, carefully and without performance, to be better than that hurt. She wrote that she hoped the city was kind to him. She did not ask for forgiveness. He appreciated that. Forgiveness, when it came, would be for his benefit rather than hers, and she had understood that correctly. He folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. Sungjin swept without comment. Outside, December light came through the garage bay door at a low angle and lay in a warm stripe across the concrete floor, the way winter light in Seoul did on the good days, thin and clean, and just enough. Taeyong kept his word. The city changed in the particular slow way that cities change when the organizing logic underneath them shifts. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of smaller adjustments that added up, over months and then years, to something recognizably different. Businesses that had operated under the silent weight of Chairman Kang De-young's authority reopened with a different quality. The Mapo district, which had been declining under management decisions made for reasons that had nothing to do with the district's actual needs, began to recover. Officials who had maintained their calculated silences found those silences were no longer required, and in many cases, moved without particular ceremony in directions that better reflected their actual convictions. Taeyong asked Junho to advise him. Junho agreed on the condition that his involvement remained unofficial, his compensation remained modest, and that whenever Taeyong's expanding influence pressed against a decision that required choosing between consolidating power and doing the thing that was actually correct, he would call Junho first. "You want to be my conscience," Taeyong said, not unkindly. "I want to be your reminder," Junho said. "That power without accountability dismantles itself. You've watched it happen once. That should be enough." Taeyong smiled slightly. I think you are more dangerous as an advisor than you would have been as an enemy." "Good," Junho said. "That was the intention." He kept working at Sungjin's garage. He had been offered better positions. Taeyong had connections, and word moved through certain circles that Junho Beek was someone whose judgment was sound and whose loyalty, once given, was structural. He declined them all. There was something in the rhythm of the garage that he needed, the honesty of mechanical problems, the clean satisfaction of returning broken things to working order, the absence of ambiguity in whether a repair had succeeded. He needed that alongside the more complicated work of advising Taeyong, the way some people need quiet rooms alongside the rooms full of noise. He began attending community meetings in the Chairmangdimun district, initially as a listener and eventually as someone who spoke when he had something specific to say. He helped organize a program that placed young men from the district into technical apprenticeships. He did not describe this as his purpose or his calling. He described it as something that needed doing and that he happened to be in a position to help with. A postcard arrived from Paris in February, 4 months after Seoyeon's departure. A photograph of the Tagus River at sunset on one side. 3 sentences on the other. "I am safe. I am learning French badly but improving. I hope the engines are good to you." Junho smiled at the last sentence. He did not write back. Their chapter was complete and they both knew it, and some chapters were better honored by being complete than by being extended. One evening in March, he was closing the garage when a teenager from the neighborhood appeared at the bay door. The boy was 17, had the particular combination of capability and directionlessness that Junho recognized from his own history, and had apparently been told by someone that the man at this garage might be worth talking to. "I want to learn," the boy said. His name was Duyun. "Engines, but also how to not make bad decisions." Junho looked at him for a moment. "Those are related skills," he said. "The first one I can teach you here. The second one takes longer and most of the learning happens away from the garage." He opened the door wider. "Start with the transmission on the bench. I'll show you what it's supposed to look like when it works." Duyun came every day that week, and the week after. By the 3rd week, he had stopped asking Junho to show him things and had started simply working beside him, asking specific questions when something was unclear, staying quiet when it wasn't. Junho noted this with approval and said nothing about it because it did not require saying. On the last evening of March, Junho locked the garage and walked home through the Chairmangdimun streets in the specific kind of Seoul evening that arrived in spring. Warm enough to leave your coat open. The city's noise subdued to something that almost resembled comfort. The lights beginning to come on in apartments and restaurants in the way that evening lights do, when a day has been spent doing something worth spending it on. He thought about Chairman Kang De-young in a federal facility somewhere, accounting for 20 years of decisions that had finally arrived at their natural conclusion. He thought about Seoyeon learning French badly, but improving in Paris. He thought about Taeyong, who called him on Tuesdays to talk through whatever decision was currently pressing, and who had, in Junho's considered estimation, the potential to build something that lasted because he was willing to be questioned. He thought about the moment on the rooftop parking level of the Lot World Tower, standing on the rooftop watching the city glow below, trusting completely in someone who was already choosing otherwise. He thought about it without flinching, which was itself the evidence of the work he had done, the proof that the 3 years had not been simply endured but used. The city did not know his name. It had no reason to. He had not rebuilt Seoul or dismantled an empire. He had provided one careful push among several, at the right moment, in the right direction, with the right conditions attached. The outcome was real. His part in it was small. That proportion felt correct. He walked home through streets that did not know what they owed him, and owed him nothing on account of that. The sky over Seoul held the particular orange that comes just after sunset, before dark completes itself, when the city is still deciding what the night is going to be. Junho Beek had been sacrificed by someone he loved, imprisoned for something he did not do, released into a city that had continued without him, and had chosen, not once but daily, in the accumulated small decisions that constitute a character, to build something from all of that which was not bitterness and not performance, and not the mirror image of what had been done to him. He had not become Kang. He had not become the anger. He had become, through patience and attention and the willingness to repair things rather than only dismantle them, something that had no dramatic name and required no audience. He had become, simply, the person he had decided to be. The light over Seoul held for a few minutes longer. Then the city turned on its lights, the way it did every night, indifferent and luminous and entirely unaware of the quiet man walking home through it who had helped make it marginally more honest. And that was exactly enough. And,